Before we begin, we'd like to thank the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs for their financial support to ARCUS and to this seminar series. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Henry Huntington is the Arctic Science Director for the Ocean Conservancy and is also an independent researcher. Huntington's research looks primarily at human-environment interactions in the Arctic, including as well as topics such as shipping and fishing. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Weather, Climate, and Society. Welcome, Henry. At this point, I'll turn the seminar over to you.
Thanks, Betsy. And let's see. I think you need to end sharing and then I can start. There we go. Great. Well, thank you all for coming this morning. Very nice to see you here. I will be talking, as you know, about Arctic commercial shipping and its effects on environment and communities. And I'll do this in the context of what's happening with Arctic shipping, with some commentary on governance, both internationally and by the different countries involved, and then some discussion about at least what I see as some of the priorities for further work and attention. This talk is based on a paper that several others and I published, including Edwards Dorr, who I think is on the call this morning, in Transportation Research Part D. We published that earlier this year. And it was an attempt to take a broad look at Arctic shipping, sort of where things stand. This was done most comprehensively, of course, in the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment that came out in 2009. We made no attempt to repeat all of the work that went into that, but we thought it was worth taking another look at things on a broad level after 14 years later. There have been, of course, many papers and many studies looking at different aspects of Arctic shipping in the years since then. I again don't pretend that we offer the level of detail on specific topics that any of those papers do, but I think the broad brush has been it was enlightening to me at least, and I hope will be of interest to you. So we'll start with a few basics, and I realize that some of this may be sort of fairly basic information for many of you, but it's worth going over again just to make sure we all start with a common understanding. Of course, there are lots of ways you could get through the Arctic Ocean. Broadly, there are three major shipping routes that people talk about. On the right, the Northeast Passage, going across northern Eurasia. This includes the Northern Sea Route, which runs from the Kara Gates down in the lower right at the boundary of the Barents and Kara Seas at the south end of Novaya Zemlya to the Bering Strait. In Russian administrative terms, that's the zone of the Northern Sea Route, and things to the east of that in the Barents Sea or to the south in the Bering Sea are not part of the Northern Sea Route, though they might be considered part of the Northeast Passage. And as the map shows, of course, the Northeast Passage has various routes above and below and around some of the islands off of the Russian coast. It might be like the Northwest Passage, it might be better considered the Northeast Passage is. But in general, we talk about the Northeast Passage, and that's the route in question. Similarly, the Northwest Passage going across northern North America, finding its way through the Canadian archipelago from the Davis Strait to Bering Strait. And last, of course, the Transpolar Route going straight through the middle, which at the moment is not a particularly viable route just because of the presence of sea ice, but one that seems to be attracting a bit of attention, and I think is certainly worth considering, and I'll have a bit more to say about that too. So let's start with a look at each of these, a little bit more detail at each of the passages. The Northeast Passage, as I mentioned, from the Bering Sea to the Barents Sea, including the Northern Sea Route. The first single-season passage of the Northeast Passage happened in 1932. The peak of traffic was in 1986-87. A lot of times we get a lot of attention to increasing traffic in the Northeast Passage these days, at least prior to the war in Ukraine. But it's important to remember that the peak actually occurred during the Soviet era, when an awful lot was happening in the Soviet North. In 2019, there were 31.5 million tons of shipping went along the Northeast Passage in one form or another. Of course, COVID and the war in Ukraine have changed that, at least in the short term. But that 31.5 million tons was a part of a steady increase that we'd seen over several years. Most of this is liquefied natural gas and crude oil in the form of exports from Russia. And a lot of attention is given in the Northeast Passage to transit traffic going from East Asia to Europe, and all of the stats about how much shorter it is to go from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Northeast Passage than it is to go around South Asia through the Suez Canal and so on. But that transit traffic is still relatively low. Even prior to COVID and Ukraine, there was some transit traffic, but a lot of it seemed to be in the mode of sort of an exploration or a demonstration by that it could be done, rather than a very strong interest in maximizing the cargo potential of the Northeast Passage. Of course, the war in Ukraine has changed this quite a bit. Exports from Russia to Europe have dwindled. Exports to East Asia, however, especially to China and to other places, have increased, and there's some concern that Russia is so eager to capitalize on whatever trade it can get that the quality of ships involved and so on may be declining, and that's a worry we'll talk about later as well. The Northwest Passage, again across northern North America, going from the Bering Sea to Davis Strait. The first single season transit was in 1944, so not that long after the first one in the Northeast Passage. But it really hasn't developed in a commercial way, in the way that the Northeast Passage has. Partly because Canada has not had that much interest in promoting development of Arctic resources the way Russia has, or the Soviet Union had, and now Russia has. And so the first commercial transit of the Northwest Passage wasn't until 2013. This has really not taken off in any substantial way, and there are a variety of reasons for that. There is some export traffic from Canada, shipping currently from the Mary River iron mine on Baffin Island. In the 80s, there was some from the Bent Horn oil prospect on Little Cornwallis Island in the middle of the archipelago. And of course, there's a fair bit of resupply. The picture here is the cargo ship delivering supplies to Clyde River or Kungakugapik on Baffin Island in Nunavut. And as in Alaska, as in other Arctic places, resupply by ship is a vital thing for coastal communities. And so there's a fair bit of traffic of delivering fuel, delivering heavy supplies, and so on. We're talking, though, about transit passages through the Northwest Passage. At the moment, most of these voyages are either passenger ships, of which there aren't that many going all the way through, or expedition ships, private parties making their Northwest Passage on a sailing boat or a private yacht or other things. Again, not getting nearly the level of traffic that the Northeast Passage does. Now to consider the Transpolar Route. Remember, this is the one that goes straight across the middle, doesn't have to go to the North Pole, but it can go nearby. Again, from the Bering Sea to the North Atlantic. This, of course, as a straight line, is the shortest route from the North Pacific to the North Atlantic. There remains year-round sea ice in the Central Arctic Ocean, in at least some of it, enough to make this not a particularly viable route for ordinary ships. So it's not surprising that there have not been any commercial transits yet. There have been voyages by research vessels and by passenger ships. The passenger ships typically going to the North Pole to deliver tourists their shot at standing at 90 degrees north, and research vessels going from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and going all the way through the middle, just to add to what we know about a region that doesn't get a whole lot of attention and hasn't had a whole lot of human presence. When we think about the environment, there are a few concerns that we have about what commercial shipping can do. And these are common concerns that we can see in just about anywhere in the world. There's nothing particularly special about the Arctic when it comes to these concerns. Some of this, of course, is from ordinary operations. Just a ship makes noise, it emits exhaust. There are some kinds of emissions of wastewater and other things that go over the side. There are some rules on what can be released from a ship, but a lot of things can be. And in a place like the Arctic, where there are no shore facilities for offloading, say, wastewater, ships really don't have much of a choice, and therefore are allowed, provided they're sufficiently far from shore, to just dump things into the ocean. Again, this is normal operations anywhere in the world. But any of these things has a consequence for the environment. Noise will disturb the sea life. Doesn't just have to be marine mammals, includes seabirds, fish, other things in the water. And of course, the pollution can enter the ecosystem, enter the food web, and be taken up by the animals that are in the area. Again, a lot of this, the type of pollution, this type of disturbance is just from routine operations. There's just no way around it. Perhaps a bigger concern, or at least a somewhat different concern, is that of accidents and oil spills. These can be catastrophic rather than just chronic, as is the case with, say, noise from ships operating in a certain area. And I don't know whether we would consider accidents and spills to be inevitable. I suppose it depends on how you look at that. None of them, all of them can be avoided. But if you're going to have enough operations, sooner or later something is going to go wrong. And the question is, how much can we do to try to prevent that and be ready to respond quickly and effectively when it does happen? And we'll get into some of the measures that have been taken to try to help reduce these risks later on. What we can certainly say is that if you have more shipping, the risk is going to be there. Whether we have an accident or a spill is a different question. The risk will certainly be there. We can say the same thing about invasive species. I don't know that it's inevitable that we're going to have introductions, but the risk is certainly there, whether from ballast water or things clinging to the hull or other ways of introducing new species into waters where they aren't known. Ships moving from one place to another are a pretty effective vehicle for delivering species along with anything else that they're carrying. Finally, there's a concern about habitat degradation. I would say from ordinary commercial shipping, this is perhaps a little less of a concern. If we're getting into things like commercial fishing and especially bottom trawling, then we have an increased concern about destruction or degradation of benthic habitat. At the moment, there's not a great deal of fishing north of the Bering Strait. There is, of course, in the Bering Sea, but north of the Bering Strait in the Chukchi Sea and beyond on the Pacific side. But Russia has started opening up their part of the Chukchi to some commercial fishing. This is not not just a theoretical question, but one that is becoming a practical one. And of course, there's a great deal of fishing on the Atlantic side in the Barents Sea and around Svalbard and so on. There are, in addition, a number of cultural concerns for the people who live in the area. Disturbance of hunting and fishing is one. And this can happen in two ways. One, direct disturbance, in other words, affecting people who are in their boats. The photo that you see here is in Savunga on St. Lawrence Island in the northern Bering Sea. Some local folks in the boat in the foreground who've actually been out fishing for crabs along the shoreline. And in the background, the resupply barge coming into town. I don't think anybody begrudges the resupply barge bringing things that people need for the year and so on. But there's still no question that it's a bit difficult to hunt in the area of a ship If you're in a small boat and a big ship is producing a big wake, or of course, if you're concerned about where the bullets might go and so on. So the presence of ships can be a disturbance of hunting activities. It's also the indirect effect of affecting the prey species. Many reports from people along the coast that after a ship has gone by, the marine mammals tend to be wary for a day or two, harder to hunt, a little bit more concerned about additional noise, say from the boats like the one in the foreground in the photo. And so that can reduce some of the opportunities for hunting, especially in times as we've seen of late, where the hunting season can be shorter and shorter depending on weather and ice conditions. And so the loss of a day or two, if that's one of the prime days for going hunting, but the animals have left the area or have become wary and are harder to find and harder to take, can have a big effect on a community. We also see social disruption in Indigenous communities, and this can come in many forms. There are some when, say, a cruise ship comes in and hundreds of passengers come ashore. I have had friends in Arctic communities tell me that it's actually kind of fun to have a bunch of visitors come and get to meet some new people and so on. So there's certainly some upsides, but it can also be a lot to take in. And we do know certainly of reports of people who do things in Arctic communities that I at least hope that they would never trust that they would never do at home, of going up and peering in people's windows and moving around people's yards and looking under things and opening up shed doors and things like that. That could be a matter of just educating people and telling them that it's okay to be curious, but not okay to start invading people's privacy and property like that. But still, this is has happened often enough that it seems to be a concern in many places, especially those that see a lot of tourist traffic. Also have a bit of disruption in terms of the social and economic effects of the supplies coming in or people getting involved in shipping and how the benefits of that are distributed within the community. There's concern in many areas too about destruction of archaeological sites. Some of this can be inadvertent if it's just a case of say a big wake washing on a shoreline site. Presumably those are also exposed to wind-driven waves and so on. So I don't know that ships are adding waves that have not been seen in other ways. But oftentimes people are drawn to these sites or may go and visit. And just as poking around in Indigenous communities in the way you wouldn't do at home, people are curious and may start looking at things and digging things up and seeing the potential for a souvenir. This can be a concern as well about many sites around the Arctic that are not well documented and certainly not well protected. In addition to the concerns, we also, of course, have to remember that shipping provides lots of benefits to Arctic communities. We talked a little bit about supplies. This is certainly the cheapest way to deliver fuel, to deliver heavy things, whether it be building materials, durable, non-perishable items for the store, et cetera, et cetera. And we can see the effect that has when there are disruptions to the supply chain. This happened in Nome some years ago. They hadn't gotten enough fuel during the summer to last through the whole winter, and the ice started forming. And this was going to be a big problem for Nome. And at that time, a couple Russian vessels came, ice-strengthened vessels came and helped deliver the fuel to Nome and saved them the trouble of having to rely on what would have been very expensive fuel flown into the community. Other communities such as Noatak, a little ways up Noatak River, Noatak has, thanks to changes in the river, has lost their ability to receive supplies by barge. In other words, fuel and other things have to be flown in. And the result is that heating oil and gasoline for boats and snow machines and so on is much more expensive than it is in communities that can receive supplies by sea. Again, I don't think anybody begrudges the vessels like the one in the background here in this photo that are bringing those things to communities. And it provides some opportunities as well, some economic opportunities, as I mentioned, some social opportunities to meet people who have come in and provide a change of scenery or some new faces in town to meet and so on. In the case of cruise ships with at least some warning, many people can sell handicrafts and other things, and so there are some economic opportunities that can go widely in a community. Let's switch now to talk about governance. What we've talked about so far are 3 major shipping routes, and then some of the environmental and cultural concerns that we have with shipping. So the question is, what do we do about managing the traffic along those routes to address the environmental and cultural concerns that we have? And let's start with international work. The International Maritime Organization, or IMO, has passed the Polar Code. That was several years in the making, but a major addition to doing Arctic shipping according to some decent standards. And this applies to, the Polar Code has provisions for the ships. They have to be up to a certain standard and be able to do certain things operating in Arctic waters. It applies to the crew. They have to have enough skill and knowledge to be able to operate safely in the Arctic and know what they're getting into. And it touches a bit on actions and behaviors, such as discharges, such as routes, and so on. Now, some of that, such as the discharges, remains theoretical in that things shouldn't be disposed of overboard. But as I mentioned, unless you have a shore facility where things can be unloaded, the ship really has no choice. They can't continue to carry an endless supply of wastewater and other things with them. The shipping routes and so on have been developed not as necessarily as part of the Polar Code, but as part of the attention that we're getting to the Arctic. And I'll show the Bering Strait shipping routes and areas to be avoided in a later slide. But these are things that have been done through the IMO and have to be done through the IMO because the Bering Strait and many other areas are international straits, meaning that a ship that's just passing through, so-called innocent passage, can't be regulated by the coastal state. So a boat that's going from, say, Japan to Canada, going through the Bering Strait, going between Little Diomede Island and the Alaska mainland, so in U.S. waters, if it's just passing through, there's really not that much the U.S. can do to regulate what the ship is doing. However, if there are IMO rules, then it's a different story. And so this has been a big plus to get the IMO's attention to creating those kind of rules that can apply to all ships going through. A ban on heavy fuel oil in the Arctic, I believe, is set to take effect next year, 2024. This will have an effect on some ships. There are loopholes for coastal supply and other things, but it will affect, among other things, large cruise ships going to Svalbard. So Svalbard will probably not see huge cruise ships anymore. We'll probably see much smaller expedition style ships. The IMO has also been having discussions about noise reduction. This can happen in a few ways. Reducing speed will reduce noise. That, of course, may not be the optimal solution if you're trying to get some cargo from one place to another, but can be effective, especially in particularly sensitive areas. Another is redesign of propellers and other things to be less noisy as they do their work. So this is encouraging that the IMO is taking up the question of noise in the sea, and hopefully that'll lead somewhere. In addition, it's interesting that the Inuit Circumpolar Council, or ICC, has been recognized at the IMO. It might be provisional at this point, but they're on their way to being properly recognized. And they're the first Indigenous organization to receive this status. The IMO typically has been involved, mainly concerned about maritime safety, maritime trade, and so on, with environmental and cultural concerns coming in, quite a ways behind that. And so their openness to including an Indigenous organization, and the ability of ICC to be able to speak on their own behalf at IMO meetings is a good step forward of further attention to cultural concerns, which, of course, are, as I've explained, a big deal in the Arctic. Let's now go through country by country and talk about the governance as we've seen. And here I should say, by governance, I mean this in a broad sense of the ability to manage or influence what is happening in the marine environment, and particularly with shipping. In the case of Russia, they have a dedicated government department, the Northern Sea Route Administration. They take the Northern Sea Route specifically, and the Northeast Passage more generally, very seriously. This is a major economic contributor to Russia. Not surprisingly, they've invested in many icebreakers, far more than any other country. They have a formal governance structure for administering this area, for who does what, who has authority to do various things. A fee structure for vessels coming through. Some question about the legality of that, whether this is in fact subject to Russian control or if it's an international passage and so on. But in practice, they've been ruling that pretty tightly. And it's important to note that Russia's main interest in the Northern Sea Route is economic growth. They want to see shipping, they want to see exports, they want to see lots of activity. And this has been one of their big responses to sanctions thanks to the Ukraine war, has been to try to increase the exports, or to make the most they can of the exports they can that come from along the Northern Sea Route, whether that's natural gas from Yamal or other resources that are going to countries in Asia and elsewhere. Norway actually has more Arctic shipping traffic than any other country. It's not too surprising when we consider that it's relatively populated relative to other parts of the Arctic, and along the Norwegian mainland, pretty much ice-free year-round. So there's not much to impede traffic. A fair number of people, fair amount of activity, lots of commercial fishing, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of maritime traffic, this is a fairly busy part of the Arctic. Norway has some pretty strict environmental rules around Svalbard. As I mentioned, the heavy fuel oil ban will tighten that even further, reducing large cruise ships. And they're also doing a variety of other things. For example, approaches to polar bears. I think the new rule will be that you have to stay 500 meters at least away from polar bears. So, if you're tourists trying to get a glimpse of a polar bear, the hopping in a Zodiac and going for a close look is no longer going to be legal in Svalbard. On the Norwegian mainland, there's also a lot of interest among various Norwegian ports for capitalizing on the expected or hoped for increase of Arctic traffic. Some of this is linked to China and China's Belt and Road Initiative, which, if you've seen some of the plans, has elaborate ideas about lots of things that could be done to increase connectivity and trade and transport all around the world, including the European North. The degree to which those ports will actually receive much increased traffic is of course another question, but there's at least local interest in some of those opportunities. It's not limited to Norway, as we'll see in a sec. Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard and Transport Canada have been working on low impact shipping corridors, which is another way of saying routes that go through the Canadian archipelago that try to avoid, or at least reduce the effects on ecologically important areas and coastal communities. So there's a fair bit of thought and effort going in, consultation with Inuit communities and others, to try to come up with routes that make sense, that are reasonable from a maritime point of view, but also help reduce the effects of shipping. With this in mind, Canada seems to have a neutral position on shipping. Remember, Russia is pretty strongly promoting shipping through the Northeast Passage. Canada is not really promoting shipping through the Northwest Passage. They're just preparing for what may happen. The good attention to Inuit rights in this area, not surprisingly, given the current government of Canada, given the attention to the territorial powers of Nunavut and the Northwest Passage and Northwest Territories and so on. So Canada may be neutral on shipping, but they're certainly very interested in doing what they can to respect Inuit rights in the area. I've said compliance with rules is uncertain, and I don't mean to imply that it's a lawless area. What I mean here is that Canada has limited capacity to be active in governance in the area. They have a couple icebreakers, but most of their assets and resources are quite a ways away. So unlike Russia, which has the capacity to enforce its policies and so on, I would say the U.S. and Canada both have less ability in that regard. Now, temper this by saying that hard enforcement is not the only way to go about things. There lots of evidence from shipping in other parts of the world too that soft enforcement is a powerful mechanism. Encouragement for ships and shipping companies to do certain things. Clear communication about expectations. Sometimes those can find their way into the insurance policies for a given voyage, which provides a very strong incentive for ships to toe the line, and other mechanisms like that. So I don't mean to imply that the North American Arctic is lawless as far as shipping, just that the capacity for enforcing governance is quite a bit lower than in Arctic Russia. Of course, this brings us to the U.S. Now, the Coast Guard has given a fair bit of attention to Arctic shipping. They published the Port Access Route Study, or PARS, for the Bering Strait area in 2016, and that included various shipping measures, some of which were then adopted, albeit in some cases in somewhat modified form, by the IMO. And I'll come back to that point. They're working on doing something similar for the Arctic waters, for the Chukchi and Beaufort seas. This was underway, and then COVID put a halt to that for a while, but they're getting going again on working their way through that access route study, which presumably will also include some types of routing measures and other things to help govern shipping in the U.S. Arctic. Fair bit of attention has been given lately to the investment in the deepwater port in Nome. Construction is underway on that to build a much longer pier out into deeper water to accommodate bigger ships and so on. I'd mentioned in the case of Norway that there are a lot of ports in Norway interested in getting engaged with increased shipping and looking for ways to capitalize on the economic opportunity. I suspect Nome may be in a similar position of hoping that having a deep water port will give them some opportunities. My own view is it's a little unclear on how many ships will actually take advantage of that and how much business they'll receive. Bringing a bunch of cargo to Nome makes sense if you're resupplying Nome. It doesn't make so much sense if you're trying to get that cargo on to other destinations. The same dilemma faces places along the Norwegian coast that as a transshipment area, you're still a ways away from the big markets further south in Europe, and it's not clear what the economic potential is. The U.S. has made a modest investment in Coast Guard capacity in the Arctic, some seasonal presence in Kotzebue and Utqiagvik and Nome and so on. The most glaring example here, of course, is the state of the U.S. icebreaker fleet. There's frequently talk about building new icebreakers, but at least as far as I know, we have not yet started building any new icebreakers to add to the aging fleet that we already have. How much the U.S. is really invested in the governance of Arctic shipping, I think, remains to be seen. Let me shift now to talking about priorities for the future. The Bering Strait has to be on that short list. All three routes converge here. Any ship going from Atlantic to the Pacific is going to go through the Bering Strait. Any ship going from the Pacific to the Arctic is going to go through the Bering Strait. And so we see quite a lot of activity. Of course, I'm coming from the Russian coast. As I mentioned, Russia's interest in exporting liquid natural gas, crude oil, minerals, etc., is going to lead to ships coming through the Bering Strait. This is, as we know, ecologically a vital area. Millions of seabirds, lots of marine mammals, major migrations, et cetera, all converging through this area. And when I spoke earlier about the potential for a spill or an accident, it'd be hard to find a worse place for that to happen than the Bering Strait. Of course, this is also a culturally vibrant area. Indigenous peoples on both sides of the strait, on the islands in the middle, all of them practicing traditional ways, continuing to make use of their environment and to continue the relationships that they have had with marine mammals, seabirds, fish, etc. All of which is very important, and all of which shipping poses a risk. Finally, of course, the Bering Strait is the maritime border between the US and Russia. And in somewhat happier times, the US and Russia were able to cooperate and do things. And again, I'll come back to that in a sec. And there was good, at least communication between the Coast Guards about keeping track of what was happening in the region and helping out as needed. Now, of course, relations are not the same. And we have reports of ships operating close to the border, whether flexing muscles or what have you. It's a little hard to say, but it creates the potential, at least, for some sort of games of brinksmanship and other things, all of which could lead to some pretty poor outcomes. And so, unfortunately, this becomes yet another reason that the Bering Strait is a big interest, is the potential for some kind of a showdown or even clash between the US and Russia. I've spoken a bit about maritime safety. This is a big priority as well. Reducing those risks. We cannot eliminate the risks of accidents and spills, but we can certainly do things to help reduce those risks. Whether that has to do with the qualities, the capabilities of the ship, training of ship's crews. It can do with better charts and navigation. There have been a few well-publicized cases, especially in the Canadian Arctic recently, of ships running aground on uncharted reefs and other things. If we don't know what the hazards are, it's hard to avoid them. And so more attention to the mapping those waters and understanding where hazards are would be valuable. I think governance is heading in the right direction in some places. The ability to enforce or at least pay attention is a little less clear. And again, by enforcement, I don't simply mean, say, the ability to board a ship and take over and sort of show hard enforcement. Sometimes this is just a question of paying attention and communicating. We've talked with folks at the Marine Exchange of Alaska. They will talk about a lot of what they do is, hey, contacting a ship that seems to be heading in a direction that doesn't quite make sense, or doing something that might indicate a problem, and getting ahead of the problem and saying, hey, why haven't you moved in a couple hours? No, if there's a good reason, then it's no problem. If they run out of power and are scrambling to try to get their engines back online, then you might want to start to mobilize resources to help them. It's also a question with maritime safety about high standards versus economics. And sometimes the idea is, well, if the higher the standards, it makes it more expensive and therefore harder for companies to comply. There may be some truth to that, but I've also had discussions with shipping executives, actually in both Russia and China, about this. And I think everyone agrees that an accident is bad for everybody. And so if we have low standards for shipping, if we're really encouraging companies and other operators who are not willing to invest in proper ships and crew training and so on, we increase the risk of an accident, and that makes everybody look bad. And it also becomes a competitive disadvantage for the companies that are trying to do things well. Whereas having high standards actually can reward the companies that are willing to invest and intend to invest in good ships and well-trained crews and so on. And so I think there is an argument to be made, at least for the long run, that high standards can actually be a good business investment. But I think we need more attention to figuring out how to promote those standards and set them up in ways that really do have a good effect on maritime. Finally, things that the IMO can do. And let me stop for a second and talk about the figure here. These are the shipping routes through the Bering Strait that I had mentioned. The linear features in a sort of medium gray are the shipping routes that boats should follow as they're going through the area. The sort of whiter colored areas around St. Lawrence Island in the middle, around Nunivak Island in lower right, around Fairway Rock in the upper middle, are areas to be avoided. There's places ships shouldn't go unless they have a specific reason. For example, delivering supplies to Savunga or Gamble on St. Lawrence Island. The shipping routes and the ATBAs showed in white were adopted by the IMO in 2018. This was a joint proposal. The shipping routes were a joint proposal by the US and Russia. And this is significant. Even in 2018, the US and Russia were not seeing eye to eye on most things. The US was still punishing Russia for the annexation of Crimea. And I think it came as a surprise to many of us that they had actually had enough communication to propose jointly to a set of shipping routes. The US proposed the three areas to be avoided that are shown on the map. And there's been discussion of an additional one, the one in the top middle with the diagonal lines in it, around Diomede Island. And I think the hope was that Russia would propose one on their side of the border as well to match that. Of course, nothing has happened on that, and I don't know what the prospects are for US-Russian cooperation anytime soon. But again, I'd point out that 2018 was not exactly a high watermark of good relations, and yet we were able to work on something. Whether some of these shipping lanes will be extended further into the Chukchi Sea or other areas is a good question. I think there's a potential for additional areas to be avoided as well that could be done through the IMO. Now, I'd mentioned that the IMO is at least taking up the question of noise reduction. That's a good thing. We'd like to see more done and leading to real action. I would also suggest that now is the time for the IMO to start paying attention to the Transpolar Sea Route. Nothing much is happening along that route at the moment, but to me that makes this the ideal time to come up with governance mechanisms and proceed with coming up with ways to manage shipping when it happens rather than wait until after it's happened and then essentially ratify the kinds of behaviors that are already taking place. This relates in part to emergency response. Now, as I mentioned, the Northern Sea Route, lots of icebreakers, lots of Russian investment, pretty good capacity for emergency response. Somewhat less so in the North American Arctic, and next to none on the Transpolar Route. It just is very little that anybody can do. We do have the Arctic Council's search and rescue agreement, which divides up the Arctic into different zones, but a lot of that is theoretical. It's just there's not much we can do if there was a big ship with lots of people up at near the North Pole. It's going to be hard to get there quickly. So finding ways that we can respond to an emergency and handle something such as a ship losing power in the Transpolar Route, I think would be advisable things to do before we start undertaking shipping along through those waters. The final thing about governance, a few questions here for priorities for the future. Now, as I've mentioned several times, Russia has the most governance capacity in the Arctic. So far, that's being harnessed mainly for economic opportunity. Whether Russia would be interested in in using that to address environmental and cultural concerns is a good question. What the rest of the other Arctic countries can learn from Russia about what it takes to have that kind of governance and what can be done with that kind of capacity is another opportunity. Should the day come again when other countries are willing to work together with Russia. This is partly a question too of how the US and Canada will allocate resources for Arctic shipping, or how much they will allocate. We're seeing good attention, the Arctic Port Access Route Study in the US, low impact shipping corridors work in Canada. These are good measures. How we put those in practice and what we can do to make sure we're prepared to deal with shipping that comes through those waters is perhaps another question. It's also a question about what role non-Arctic countries will play. The photo here is the Huangpu River in Shanghai. China has been very interested in the Arctic, in Arctic shipping. It's featured in the Belt and Road Initiative as the Polar Silk Route. But what role China would play, say, at the IMO? Would they be supportive of measures that help address environmental and cultural concerns, say investing in noise reduction measures or other things of that kind? That's unclear at this point. If they are, I think we could see some good measures toward good international cooperation towards coming up with good ways of addressing many of those concerns. If many countries say, well, that's all well and good, but that's expensive and we have goods to deliver, we could see a different type of discussion. And then what about Indigenous rights? ICC has a space in the room at the IMO meetings. Canada has been paying attention to Indigenous rights. The US Coast Guard has been good about getting out to coastal communities in Alaska to discuss first the Bering Strait work and now the Arctic work. But what further will be done in this regard, and how far will that go? I think that's an open question for governance, and I'm optimistic that ICC and others will use their platforms and their ability to push for further recognition of Indigenous rights. So finally, to wrap up, a few conclusions. Just repeating some of what's been said. The Northeast Passage has the most traffic and the greatest governance capacity. A little less clear how Russia is going to use that and under what circumstances they might use it for anything other than promoting as much economic opportunity as they can get. The Northwest Passage, modest traffic and limited governance, although I'd say Canada certainly is attentive to environmental and cultural concerns, and I would say the US has been paying attention to those as well. So that's encouraging, but I don't know how much more traffic we expect to see through the Northwest Passage. The Transpolar Route, of course, no traffic and also no governance. As I said before, I would like to see that we address governance questions before we start to see traffic. And I think this is an area that the IMO could take up. Finally, the role of international cooperation, the involvement of non-Arctic countries, the ability to work with Russia and so on, including questions of militarization. Are we going to see increased military activity? Are we going to see Navy ships going through the Bering Strait, which would change things in many ways? These remain a big uncertainty. And so, much as I'd love to have a crystal ball and be able to say what is coming, I think there are a number of uncertainties that we face in any attempt to try to predict or forecast or even anticipate what's happening in the Arctic. Nonetheless, I think there are things that we can continue to work on, and I hope this has been of interest to all of you. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to have questions. Sorry for having taken up most of the hour. I'll stop sharing so that we can look more easily at the chat and so on. So
thank you, Henry. That was a really interesting conversation or presentation. And I think you can probably see from the chat that there's been tremendous communication and conversation going on between different people who are participating. I won't try to read all those questions, but as a reminder, as we go into the question and answer, first of all, this entire presentation has been recorded and it will be archived and available for people to view and review later on. We're going to start the question and answer period now, and if you are joining, and you can ask questions either by raising your hand, or I will read some of the questions that have been presented in the chat. You're also welcome to type questions into the chat and I will read them aloud. And if you're joining by phone, you'll need to raise your hand by pressing *9, ask your question aloud, and then unmute yourself by pressing *6. And if needed, if your question looks like it probably will, Henry Huntington has offered to be available for another few minutes after the top of the hour, so we can continue then. And I will do a soft close at the top of the hour, and then we'll come back on to the questions and answer. The first question that we had today, there are a lot of comments. I won't try to read all the comments because there was a really interesting conversation that was going on. But Nicholas Parlato said, thank you for the presentation, Dr. Huntington. Do you feel like there has been adequate uptake and enforcement of the Polar Code by Arctic port state authorities? I feel like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum would have been a kind of clearinghouse for transparent information about Polar Code adherence in national economic activity zones, but clearly they are not operating at their full capacity right now. Would you like to comment on that?
I think that's a little outside my expertise. I would be speculating. I think there's been some attention to the Polar Code, but I think there could certainly be more, both in Arctic states and beyond. So I think it remains from what I understand, sort of in the realm of encouragement to shippers rather than something that is enforced to the degree that it could be.
Okay, thank you very much. Ashley Adams asked, what are your thoughts about increasing the capacity of small communities regarding land-based oil spill response? Should there be community-based zones, based oil spill preparedness and response plans?
I think things like that would be terrific. I know there have been some efforts to do that in Alaska. I think this gets to be in practical terms, can be a real challenge of having people trained, having materials ready, being on call for something that we hope is going to be a very rare event. We can see some of that with the response capacity in, say, Cook Inlet or Prince William Sound in Alaska, where the oil shipping or oil and gas activities occur. Perhaps we could learn from some of that, but I think it'd be great to have communities prepared. I would not want to expect too much from small communities with a lot of distance between them. In other words, I think it's asking a lot of them to expect them to be responsible for a large stretch of Arctic coast.
Thank you. And there's several other questions on chat that we'll get into. We can feather them in. I see Peter Schweitzer and Jack Dibb have their hand up. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Betsy. And thank you very much, Henry, for this very interesting talk. And of course, also for the very interesting article that you published together with your co-authors. As you have pointed out, and others as well, Bering Strait traffic is, of course, what should worry us as Alaskans and those of us who care about Alaska a lot. And recent developments, as you have also pointed out, are really point in the direction of increased Russian/Chinese traffic. So my question is partially crystal ball, but partially also, what are there any kind of governance measures outside of Russia to kind of regulate this increasing traffic that could become more and more of a problem for Alaska?
Very good question. And I would say without some degree of cooperation from either Russia or the states receiving that traffic, China and other places, I'm not sure how much could be done. However, if certainly, again, I'm not sure what the prospects are with Russia at the moment, but with countries like China, if an appeal to long-term interest is helpful, that an accident here really just does not do anybody any good in the short or the long term. So let's make sure we keep those standards high and pay close attention. Maybe that's something that's worth considering. I was in Shanghai a couple of weeks ago and met with executives at one shipping company, and it was interesting to see that their knowledge of and sophistication about the Arctic was frankly quite low. Now, maybe that's just one company out of many, but I think there may also be a gap between official pronouncements of interest in polar silk roads and so on, and those actually involved in the business of shipping who say, we have shipping routes that we know and can work with and we know are effective, so let's just stick with the tried and true.
Thank you, Henry.
And why don't we go ahead and take Jack Gibbs' hand question or online.
Okay, yeah, very interesting, Henry. I had just kind of I don't know exactly if it's one or many questions, but I understand why there's some good examples of what's and critical importance of the Bering Strait region for this whole thing. But if any of these routes become more and more active for transit shipping or anything else, there's got to be stuff coming out the other side, right, into the North Atlantic or for the Northwest Sea Route through Davis Strait. And there's huge increases in shipping in the Davis Strait. A lot of it for more fishing because less ice and also cruise ships, but there's a lot of interest in extraction of all these resources that are in both Arctic Canada and Greenland. And you didn't even seem to think about that at all. And so obviously I live on the North Atlantic side of the continent, so I think about that more. But is there, have you thought about opportunities for Greenland and Canada and the US and NATO to cooperate more on these issues?
Great question, and I apologize for the specific bias in both the paper and the presentation. I think the big thing for the Bering Strait is that it's narrow. It's a lot narrower than Davis Strait. It's a lot narrower than, say, the Barents Sea.
Nares Strait is narrow also. The top of the Davis Strait is as narrow as the Bering Strait.
Yeah, if you're going up to the Arctic Ocean, but that's not
most
getting
people
the
are coming
traffic
through. Yeah, people are coming through Lancaster Sound, most of them, right?
Right, exactly. And so I do think there's a lot of reason to pay close attention in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. And the Norwegian coast, of course, deserves attention as well. Anything coming out that end of the Northern Sea Route, the Northeast Passage, is going to come along the Norwegian coast, and frankly, they should be paying attention and concerned too. So, yes, I agree that those areas deserve attention. I would still say, and this may be the Alaska bias, but still that the Bering Strait being the choke point for all of those things and being so narrow is a high priority.
Thanks. We'll do a soft close right now. For those of you who want to continue the discussion, Dr. Henry Huntington has offered to be available for another 5-10 minutes afterwards. And I will share the questions if we don't get to them that are on chat with him so that those can be followed up if possible. For those who are leaving now, on behalf of ARCUS, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And a special thanks to our speaker, Dr. Henry Huntington, for that excellent presentation. We continually work to improve our seminar series, as well as looking for suggestions for future seminar topics and speakers. So please take a minute or two to complete the short survey. A link to that is now available in the chat window. Recording of today's webinar will be archived and available on the chat on the ARCUS seminar series webpage, and an email containing a link to both the survey and the archive webinar will be sent once the video recording has been posted. That'll be sent to everybody that's registered for the event. Please visit the ARCUS homepage for more information about ARCUS, our programs, and upcoming Arctic-related activities. We want to thank you again for joining us. Okay, for those of you who are continuing to join us, the next question that I'll get to was from, let me scroll down and make sure that I get to that question. Thank you. I believe it was from Keith Alverson. How will the HFO ban affect other ships? You mentioned only cruise ships to Svalbard. What about regular shipping and research vessels?
Good question. Betsy, if you hadn't noticed, Ben Charles has his hand up too. So for
Okay, answer that and then we'll get, thanks. That just
Yep,
came up
yep.
as I was reading. Thanks.
Yep. Keith, that's a good question, and I wish I knew more of the details. I know there were some loopholes about coastal resupply and other things. I think there's a process of sort of easing into the ban on heavy fuel oils. Ultimately, it would be nice if it applied to all ships, certainly to big ships in transit and so on. And I wish I could remember the details of exactly how that plays out. And Svalbard, I think, is not. Well, Svalbard has its own set of regulations as well, and is taking this on with perhaps greater vigor than other locations in the Arctic.
Thank you. And Ben Charles, would you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Henry Huntington and Arcus, for allowing questions to be answered after your very insightful, informative presentation. I just want to thank you for really quickly for bringing up several Indigenous perspectives and cultural values that you highlighted within your presentation. I had a question in regards to the emphasis that was provided on the economic benefits and advantages associated with Arctic shipping in your presentation. How would you propose the IMO, states, countries, and agencies, as well as shipping companies, and to address the significant concerns related to food security practices, specifically Inuit food security practices, which seem to be moderately touched upon on your presentation, where they could be respected, such as what mechanisms would you recommend that could be implemented to ensure shipping entities inform Inuit communities and other Indigenous communities within the Arctic of their routes and intentions, and to ensure they adhere to guidelines that respect crucial waters and also maintaining appropriate speeds to minimize disruptions and risks to food security practices that are being conducted on within Arctic waters? And thank you again.
No, thanks, Ben, and thank you for largely answering your own question, which is I think effective communication is essential, and I think mechanisms like speed restrictions and other things can be very helpful. And communication, I think, can be in a couple directions. One is better information about where ships are and what they're doing. You're on St. Lawrence Island and you're going to spend the fuel and time and take the risk of going 50 miles out to sea to look for walrus. It sure be nice to know you're not going right in the path of a ship that'll disrupt the walrus and make all your effort come to nothing. I think it's also essential for shippers and others to be aware of the patterns and areas of use by coastal communities. Yeah, I've seen this before where people say, well, if we stay 3 miles away from the community, we won't interfere with them. It's like, well, that's not true for Arctic communities that, again, go 50 or 100 miles out to sea in small boats. And so being aware of what people do and where and so on is very important. And so I think there's a lot of scope for better two-way communication about what people do, where they go, and what to expect. I think your point about the options that shippers have is a good one. I know in some places, the White Sea, for example, they've had seasonal and other moving guidelines about ship traffic to avoid, say, pupping areas for seals. How much you could do that in real time to say, hey, 3 boats from Gamble went out this morning, please don't go here. That may be tough in terms of getting ships to pay attention at that time scale. But being aware that, hey, it's the spring walrus hunting season, this is the kind of activity going on. Please avoid this area as much as you can, or slow down. That might be something that would be possible. But I think I agree with you completely that you're introducing a new activity or increasing an activity in an area. To me, it's at least morally incumbent on you to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't disturb what's there already, rather than to say, oh, well, too bad people are out hunting, but we have a ship to sail.
Thank you. There are 4 other questions coming up that came up in the chat. The first is from Stella Bartolini Gavacci. She asks, gigatons of GHG are trapped in the Arctic permafrost and sea ice. Does the breakup of sea ice caused by ice class ships affect how much of the greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere? How does this amount compare with greenhouse gas emissions from ships themselves? Is there evidence to suggest this behavior could be contributing to the overall reduction in sea ice levels?
So if the question is, does ice-breaking activity affect
greenhouse gas
sea ice on a macro scale, and therefore, greenhouse gases or the amount of open water that's absorbing sunlight as opposed to sea ice that's reflecting sunlight and so on? I have asked this question to Andy Mahoney, a sea ice scientist at UAF, and his answer was essentially that it would take an awful lot of icebreakers to make any kind of macro level difference. The track that they're leaving is pretty small, and in fact, by breaking up the ice and exposing the water, at least in the cold weather season, you actually enhance the freezing of ice, because the open water freezes more quickly than water that's insulated with a layer of ice. And so I don't know that the ice breaking activity per se is a major contributor to any shift in greenhouse gas emissions and other things that, again, at the macro scale from sea ice.
Thank you.
At local scales, obviously, you're having it's a little bit of a different story, but at a large scale, the volume is just not there to make a difference. That's what I've understood.
Thank you. Heather Sayuk, Jean Gordon asks, I'd be curious who might be interested in funding the work needed to do marine spatial planning / modeling in the Bering Strait. I've been working on this with COERIC for the last few years. Please let me know if you're interested in doing this from an Indigenous perspective, and shares her email contact.
Great. I hope you get people to take up on that. And I think there's some possibility that National Science Foundation is one, but they're more interested in the general research questions than the specific operational ones. Whether, say, NOAA or the Coast Guard or others would be interested in something specific like this, I'm not quite sure. I know the Arctic Council, PAIM, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, or maybe it was them and perhaps the Sustainable Development Working Group, had undertaken a follow-up to the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, and looking at can't now remember the name of the report, but it was essentially areas of cultural concern and how to pay close attention and what to do. And they took a few steps in that direction, but weren't able to get into the kind of detail that Heather's talking about, which I think remains a big gap. And I think that helped address some ways what Ben raised about the type of information you need to be able to communicate effectively about how people use that environment and what's needed to. But yeah, I agree with Heather. This would be a very important thing to do.
Thank you. The 3 more questions that I'll read, and then I think that we'll be able to, we'll see if there's other questions that come up with raised hands. Sarah Hutto asks, what shipping impacts to whales via ship strikes? Who's managing that issue?
That does come up with questions of mainly questions of speed. I think we learned off the New England coast with right whales, ships going below, say, 10 knots or 12 knots. Either the whales get out of the way, or it doesn't seem to be as much of a threat as the ships going faster than that. That is something that could be done by the IMO, could be done voluntarily by shipping companies. Again, running into whales isn't really good PR for anybody. So encouragement to try to avoid that can be helpful. Unfortunately, that does seem to be just something that happens with ships, and we get whales along the southern Alaska coast that have been hit by ships. Those come from time to time, are found from time to time, and I'm sure in many more cases are not found at all. So I wish there was more to be done, but other than having an enforceable speed restrictions or some other mechanism for governing ships on that kind of small time and spatial scale, I'm not sure what can be done.
Thank you. Ed Page asked, what about voluntary safe practices / best practices? Can this be an effective governance in the Bering Strait when coupled with active monitoring?
Well, thanks, Ed. And in fact, a great setup, because Ed's the one who introduced me to this whole idea of the voluntary measures and so on. And I think that's what I was driving at with the idea of, maybe I called it soft enforcement. But having a clear set of expectations and being able to convey that to ships and keep track of them. And I think Ed's experience at the Marine Exchange of Alaska would suggest that this can be very effective. I don't have time here, but I know Ed has talked to me before about occasions with paying attention to ships as they go through the Aleutian Islands and communicating in real time with ships about what they're doing, and seeing the ship say, "Oh yeah, boy, maybe you're right, we ought to do something else." So I think that can be a very effective mechanism. So this idea again of communication and careful attention is something that can accomplish a lot.
Thanks. Ashley Adams asked, will there be opportunities for students to work with you or your institution, those who are affiliated with Canadian universities?
Canadian University, I would suggest Oceans North, which is a Canadian organization that works very, very much and pays attention to shipping. Erin Abu-Abti was a co-author on this paper. She is, I think, no longer with Oceans North, but she was when we wrote the paper. And I would strongly encourage getting a hold of them. I think it's just oceansnorth.ca, but in any case, if you search for Oceans North in Canada, you should be able to find them pretty easily. And they're the ones that are really paying close attention in Canada.
Thanks. And Ashley asks a follow-up question. I'm working on a policy.
Sorry, just in the chat, oceansnorth.org. Francesca,
got it. Thank you.
Put the link in there. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Francesca. Ashley asked, she's working on a policy brief that investigates the role of Arctic communities in oil spill preparedness and response. I'm analyzing plans and regulations. What are your thoughts?
I think it'd be an important thing to look at. And again, as I touched on earlier, I think one of the big questions is the practical versus theoretical. I think there's the theoretical idea that you have a bunch of people with boats and knowledge of that environment and so on who are on the scene and you'd hope might be able to respond quickly. That's great. We also have to remember that we're putting people potentially in harm's way. I mean, these are hazardous materials in what may be less than ideal conditions. Having the equipment there ready to go, kept in good working order and so on can be tough. And I would suggest, again, maybe looking at experiences in places like Prince William Sound and so on. What it takes to maintain that capacity and readiness and to have people trained and not to wind up causing a bigger problem than you started with. Again, I think there are a number of practical things that would be really worth paying close attention to.
Thank you. It looks like we've answered most of the questions. And as I said, there's been a lot of discussion. I'll copy the chat and share that with Henry Huntington. And if he's got, maybe he'll have an opportunity to respond to things as he sees that he wishes to. So I think with this, I don't see any other questions coming up. I really want to thank everybody for an active discussion during the presentation. It's been really amazing to see so much interaction, and great. It's exactly the kind of thing we like to see happen out of these seminars. So seeing no other questions come up. Oh, there's another one from Ben. Go ahead. And then Paul Foos. Ben?
Thank you. Sorry, I had a really quick follow-up question, Henry, in response to the dialogue that's been unfolding and the answers to the questions. How do you yourself envision the proactive steps that governments should take to uphold the principles outlined in the Arctic Peoples Declaration that was recently signed by Inuit, Sami, and other Arctic indigenous peoples within the Arctic, especially in terms of preventing environmental degradation, ensuring meaningful engagement of indigenous communities in decision-making processes, as well as affirming the commitment to the dignity of self-fulfillment and realization for indigenous peoples as it relates to the marine environment, more specifically to the topic of today's presentation, discussion of shipping. And thanks again for your really insightful presentation.
Well, thanks, Ben. And another great question. Yeah, I mean, if I was king of the world, I might have some ideas. I think here too. Well, first, I applaud those principles and the clear statement by Inuit, Sami, and others about what they would like to see. I mean, that's terrific to lay that out, and I think they have an undeniable moral and other claim to those rights and what they're looking for. To me, one of the big questions, again, maybe this is just my bias, it comes to the practical, which is, great, how many meetings can you have in a coastal community? We've seen this again and again with shipping coming up with, how many times are we going to expect people in whoops. Oh. Sorry, I just got a National Wireless Emergency Alert System test. I don't know if other people were getting that.
I think we all did.
Yeah, okay. I saw everybody sort of looking. It's like, oh, what's going on?
What's going on? It's just that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a test.
Yeah. I wondered, I saw Ben looking. I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening?
Right.
Hoping that Ben is still there. I think a lot of this then comes down to investment and again to communication. And in practical terms, I think the question is, how do we carry out the principles in a way that also works for the communities in question? Several people, including Jimmy Stotts from ICC and Akuluk Lunga from ICC in Greenland, and I wrote a paper several years ago about all the demands that happen on a community. You can imagine a meeting with a shipping company, and next week a meeting with the Coast Guard, and the next week a meeting with other people interested, and the next meeting with NOAA, et cetera. And I certainly wouldn't want to discourage people working with communities and communicating, but at some point, the demands on people's time and attention just become very, very high. And it's great if you have an entire federal government with lots of departments that can dedicate people to doing this. Another thing, if you're a village of a few hundred people and you have a bunch of other issues on your plate as well. And again, by no means am I trying to discourage or limit this type of communication and interaction, but I think this is part of the challenge, is figuring out how to make sure people have the capacity to respond effectively, and that the demands that the outside world is placing on communities are managed in a way that becomes reasonable rather than overwhelming. Just to say, hey, I'm going to send you thousands and thousands of pages of documents, and I'll meet you next week and we can talk about them. I'm not sure who that helps, but that's often a practice that we see. And so I think continuing to work on figuring out how to put these ideas into practice in a way that makes a good difference, it remains a challenge.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. Paul Foos, you had your hand up. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. What a great presentation. So I'm the past president of the Marine Exchange, and I set it up, but I just wanted to make sure you know that we do have the capability for digital fencing to, if walruses haul out, we can notify via AIS to the ships to stay out of that area, or warn people. They can't prohibit people from sailing, but maybe warn them of hunting activities. But the real risk we see now is with the shipment of crude oil, and really dramatic increases in here because of European sanctions against Russian oil. So it's all coming across and going to China. Even now it's being shipped from the Black Sea by pipeline north to St. Petersburg and coming around. And then it's going to places like India and being refined and shipped back as refined product. We're seeing it in both directions, and using ships at lower ice classifications and all. And somebody should have seen this coming. I don't know if they didn't see it coming or they just didn't care about the impact on Alaska. But the prevention measures that we have in the Aleutians ought to be applied to this area. And I just want to let you know that we are making a proposal. I've spoken directly with Rosatom and some other entities on the Russian side to see if we can get a voluntary compliance with this to enhance these prevention measures. And I'd actually like to talk to Ben about it too. Ben, I'll try to reach out to you and tell you specifically what we're looking at here. But ever since we've instituted those in the Aleutians during the time of the Seldayanga U disaster, we've never had a vessel casualty since. So this is a proven system, and it's something that we all should get together to support. Over.
Paul, that's terrific, and that's exactly the kind of mechanism that's great to learn from that experience and see how effective it can be. So thank you for your efforts there. And again, I hope that hope people recognize that that rust bucket that runs aground in the Bering Strait and causes a problem is going to be a disaster for everybody involved in shipping, not just that one ship. So it's in Russia's best interest too, not to lead to that kind of thing.
Well, this has really been terrific, and so many good resources being shared in the chat and good conversations back and forth. But I think that now that it's 23 minutes after the hour, we should go ahead and close. And as I said, we will copy the meeting chat, and I'll share the questions and comments specifically with Henry Huntington. So I think we'll close now. On behalf of ARCUS, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for your great participation in communicating with each other. And of course, a very special thanks to Henry Huntington for a really excellent presentation and great conversation after your presentation. We are continually working to improve our seminar series, as well as looking for suggestions for future seminar topics. As I said earlier, please take a minute or two to complete our short survey, and a link to that is available in the chat window. It'll also be included in the email to everybody that registered, with a link to the archived version of this presentation, along with that link when all of that is ready. Please be sure to visit the ARCUS homepage, that's arcus.org, for more information about our programs and upcoming Arctic-related activities. Again, thank you all for joining us today. This concludes our webinar. Wish you all well and have a great start to the fall. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arcus. Thanks, Betsy and Stacy.
You're welcome. This was really good. One of the
Great.
best seminars ever in my mind.
Well, very kind of you. Thanks. Hope you feel better soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.